Well, I'm Dan Robinson with the Great Lakes Spirituality Project, and I'm very happy to be talking with the Reverend Jon Magnuson today. He is the executive director of the Cedar Tree Institute in Marquette and has worked on issues around the Great Lakes and Lake Superior in particular for many years. So thank you, Reverend Magnuson, for being a part of the conversation today.
Honored to be here. Thanks, Dan.
Hey, and we've talked briefly before on the phone, so I got a little bit of your backstory. But when we talked earlier, you said that you moved to Marquette, Michigan, right there on the shores of Lake Superior when you were 10 years old. But you also said that was when you were born spiritually. Could you say a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Sure. I think everybody probably has some kind of parallel experience to this, that when they find themselves in a particular setting or a series of circumstances, their heart leaps,
Mm,
they come alive. Um, it's like, hey, I was born born to be here. This is where I fit. Now, I was 10 years old and I was raised in inner city Minneapolis, transitional neighborhood. The parks there, I remember actually being warned not to go to the parks because of the gangs in those years. And they were intimidated. That whole environment was very intimidated. I remember my playground where it was the streets. They were taking up trolley car tracks back in the 1950s. I remember playing for hours in the concrete in front of our poor, very modest home next to the church where I grew up. And so when I moved here to the Great Lakes with my family, it was like I was coming into a complete world. And so my memories of my early teenage years, they're all outside.
mm,
Basically, all my memories are engagements with the forest, bicycling, and country roads, in roaming the shores of Lake Superior, climbing cliffs. Um, so it was a coming alive for me, and then that continued over the years. Where years later, I served as a deckhand for iron ore freighter out of Duluth,
oh,
carrying iron ore into Toledo and Chicago and Cleveland. And uh, so and then when I was 18, they just busted through a road in Nipigon up in Ontario, and they made what we call the circle route of Lake Superior. And 1,500 miles. They finally connected. Before that time, before the early 1960s, mid 1960s, there was only a railroad that connected the two parts of the lake. So I bought myself, when I graduated from high school, the what was it, a bicycle, one of the first 10 gear bicycles. And I remember it took me a month, and I went around Lake
oh, wow.
Superior with a small tent, and I wasn't in a hurry. Took me a month, but again, I was able to connect with the environment, and especially the lake, the basin here. And so that was a great experience. And then years later, when I became part of what we call the Lake Superior Binational Forum, which was a federally, basically a federally directed advisory board, and I was a clergy representative. This was about 1998 to 2012. We had 3 meetings a year around the lake. So I was able to visit many of these places that I had once, when I was 18, gone through with a bicycle. So that was a wonderful connection. So that's what I meant by coming alive. And later, after I left the Great Lakes Basin to go to the university, and I traveled in the Peace Corps and lived in the Pacific Northwest, that fire burned in me, that vision, that connection, that primal connection. And I felt, hey, I'm going to return one day and do my work here, use whatever skills or gifts I have, and use them here to try to protect and preserve and celebrate this place. So That's what brought me back in 1995.
Wow. So as you think about the work that you've been doing since you've been back in 1995, you said to sort of protect this place. How would you describe that work? I mean, I know you're doing things
No.
at the Cedar Tree Institute. So talk a little bit about what you've been doing.
Sure. I'm cross-trained as a mental health professional, but also as a social worker and as an ordained clergy person. So I had a vision when I came back. Like many of us who live here, we cobble together ways to survive. That's one of the peculiar parts of living in the Upper Peninsula here. Many people put combinations of professions together, and that's what I did to come back. And so I became director of and I founded a small nonprofit called the Cedar Tree Institute. And there are three focuses. One is mental health, which I was trained in, so that would provide me some access to and professional legitimacy. Also, I was an ordained clergyman, so I was a university pastor here at the local university part-time. But my heart really was in the institute work. And so it was quiet. I used all the tricks that I had learned through my other careers to begin this institute. I kept it very small. We own no material possessions. My board suggested we continue to keep it small. So we're always project driven, and we initiate projects, provide services in the areas of mental health, religion, and the environment. And some of my projects, some people here only know me as a tree planter. We planted 25,000 trees since 1995.
Oh.
They only know me as a tree planter. Other people only know me as a counselor. And some people only know me as a campus pastor, as a teacher at the university, possibly as a leader, worship leader in my local congregation for years. But my heart was when they all come together. And that's where I think the connection is, Dan, between your work and where I come from in terms of my experience, which is the spiritual dimension of the environmental work that and consciousness that is rising, around the globe. And I have strong feelings that the spiritual faith communities have much to bring to the dialogue. We've tended to be drowned out by the scientists and the activists, but I think there are peculiar gifts that the faith community brings. And I can talk about those.
Yeah, let's
go somewhere else.
No. Tell us, what are those gifts? What do you think the
Sure,
spiritual community brings to this work?
Sure. Well, one of the things is we bring, I believe, a different sense of time that we know we're part of a vision of which we will not see the ending. That's a prayer actually from Oscar Romero, the Archbishop in Central America, was assassinated in the late 20th century. He was an advocate for the poor, but he said, we are part of a work of which we will not see the ending. Mm. And so there's a sense of, both urgency, but not desperateness. In a lot of, now I'm going to make a comment about my secular environmental colleagues. Sometimes there's a desperateness, of really frustration that if we don't get it done now, it can't happen, it won't happen. And I think the religious community at its best brings the long vision, so that how this practically unfolds is that people who are faith-based or who have a spiritual community, we know how to play. We can rest. We can say, no, we're going to eat together now. We're going to sing together now. Versus, no, we have to work. There's a tension there. We also, besides the sense of time, in other words, we're in it for the long haul. We're not going to necessarily see the fruits of our labor. And you have to have faith in that, that your life and that the world has a purpose larger than your own. In other words, we're living a drama larger than our own ego here.
Mm-hmm.
The second gift that it brings are rituals. And I think this is a beautiful thing in which people can join together with symbols, and whether it be fire, water, song, poetry, prayer, silence, and tap into a well of resources, psychological, spiritual resources that actually are a kind of nurture, a food for sustenance to keep you working, in the important work of stewardship, environmental stewardship. So rituals, a different sense of time, and then I'll leave the last one is a sense of respect for the enemy. There is a respect for individuals over ideology. And, there was a great article in Harper's Magazine, I remember back in the early 1990s, why are major churches so slow to change? If you do a historical, look at churches, we've been around for thousands of years, but the change, we're always usually on the back end of the change. And it's very frustrating for a lot of spiritual leaders or faith-based leaders. But there's a reason for that. The reason for that is there's a respect for the individual. So no matter how much you believe in a position politically or about the environment, you need to respect the person. You can disagree now, but you need to respect the person who has a different point of view. And you do not name call, you do not vilify, you do not demonize. I mean, that's part of good mental health. That's my mental health part of me speaking, in terms of a faith-based response and engagement with, secular opposition. In other words, you hold firm, but you respect the individual. And a great example of that is we did a clean sweep back in about 2004. I organized with my much appreciated environmental activists in the community, the Lake Superior Watershed Partnership. We organized a clean sweep across the Upper Peninsula, which means collecting toxics and pollutants. We did it by using parking lots during Lent, which is a time of repentance. So we had our priests and clergy. We had 250 parishes, 10 different faith traditions: Buddhist, Jewish, Catholic, Roman Catholic, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Unitarian, Episcopal, American Friends. We used parking lots, and so we had people bringing their toxic waste who were Republicans, Democrats, radicals, because they were members of these parishes, and there was a trust basis that connected us, not an ideological basis, based on your position about the environment. Mm-hmm. So in that respect, the rituals tap us into a deeper well that we can use, those of us who are committed to environmental stewardship, to help us, give us energy, give us direction, and give us efficacy so that we can make things happen. And there are networks, quiet networks that exist, as you know, within parishes and within denominational structures.
Well, you mentioned ritual, and something I'll follow up with that. What I have noticed in my experience has been that when it comes to ritual in the environment, a lot of folks lean on indigenous traditions.
Yes.
I've always been concerned about that in one sense, out of respect for those traditions and not trying to do, for white folks like myself, appropriation.
Yes.
So as a Christian pastor, what within the Christian tradition are rituals that you think would support the work that you're doing and that
Mhm.
many of us are doing in terms of protecting the Great Lakes?
Yeah, that's a great. I want to just say that I carry with me from I do a part of my commitment in the institute is to work closely with tribes up here. So we've done a lot of projects to restore native plants, mental health projects with health departments for tribes. So I'm very sensitive about respecting indigenous cultural integrity and not misappropriating the rituals. So your question is a great one. Um, just a quick comment on that. I don't ever use native rituals unless there's a native person with me doing them.
Right. Sure, absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
I won't appropriate unless
yeah.
there's something with me. And um, so back to your question, in Orthodox Christianity, I'm going to use that, my own tradition, there is what we call the Trinitarian understanding of the divine presence in the world. There are three articles. It's God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. You know, that's basically how it's spun out. But the first article is about the it's I believe in God, the creator of heaven and earth. God our Father, the creator of heaven and earth. That's the first article. And so there are people, theologians like Matthew Fox, who have said that the earth, he was now Episcopal priest. He used to be a Dominican priest. He wrote years ago that the Bible is, or the earth is our first Bible. Very interesting, based on the first article, which is, I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth. So his position was that's the first assertion of the tradition. So his position is the Bible, or the earth is the first Bible. And I like that. And so I think using, specifically speaking, rituals, I think the baptismal ritual using water, I have done many baptisms in my own tradition in lakes and streams and rivers. And there's something very powerful when you're outside using these ancient rituals in their actual natural settings. Very, very powerful. I think there are also rituals around blessing of harvests. This is of our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, Episcopal, some Lutherans, but we'll bless the harvest seeds, the blessing of seeds, the blessing of animals. That's done on St. Francis, the festival of St. Francis. That's common among many Episcopal, Lutheran, Catholic parishes, blessing of animals. So there are these animals, blessing of the seeds, using of the water. I think those are some examples that one can turn to. I think, however, just like the environmental movement is evolving, Dan, it's evolving. And Paul Hawkins talks a lot about that in his Blessed Unrest, his kind of tracing of the environmental movement, how it began, committed to preserving trees and water. And then after Rachel Carson in the 1960s, Silent Spring and the EPA, it started to then move into connected to social justice. So now we have movements called environmental justice, which is not just saving trees by wealthy folks who want a nice landscape. It's the connection between the environment and people's health. And so that's called environmental justice. So what I'm saying there is that there is an evolving, just like there is in the environmental movement, a kind of a deepening, broadening, which is exciting. There's also a deepening, broadening, and evolving consciousness in the religious traditions, if they're healthy.
Mm-hmm.
If, like Karen Armstrong says, the more fundamentalist you get, the more rigid you get. She has a great insight on this. She wrote The History of God, by the way, well-known, former nun. She said that the more rigid any system is, the more fragile it is. It's counterintuitive. The more people say, oh, that's a true believer, look at, they really believe, because they're always talking about, in my tradition, Jesus or whatever it may be. It's actually reflection of their rigidity, because they are so closed and committed to a particular doctrine or dogma or institution. So she calls it the death rattle of an institution when they're not growing and evolving, not in numbers, but in how they see themselves and in their openness to integrate and respect, for instance, other faith traditions or ideologies or scientific input. So essentially speaking, the beautiful thing about the environmental movement, it is a gift to the religious communities. It's forcing us and bringing us, just as we bring lessons to the environmental movement, right? Ritual, vision, respect for the enemy, quote, the opponent. Likewise, the environmental movement brings to us gifts to open us and involve us into a deeper, wider understanding of the sacred. And you see this the Cedar Tree Institute has tried to model that by bringing together these faith traditions around these environmental initiatives. Whereas before they would sit down and have a dinner together and say niceties to each other, but it was all obligatory. And essentially there was no real, they would talk about ideology or where they disagree about things or agree, but there was no action. There was no interfaith movement. The only place you saw that in recent American history was the civil rights movement. And now where they come together. Now you're seeing it, I think, in the environmental movement, where you get these, formerly people wouldn't talk to each other, they're competitive, They come together because Mother Earth is bringing us together. That's a beautiful gift. And I think your work, is part of that wonderful invitation to lift up a spiritual reality, a divine impulse that is underneath the activism and the need, the hunger. Where is the hunger coming from for the environment? When people join I'm having a thought now, when people join environmental active, become an environmental activist or decide to join a movement, what is that about? It's a hunger, isn't it? There's a hunger. There's a hunger. They want to see, they see potential or a possibility for something better than the world they live in. That's ultimately a spiritual value.
Mm-hmm.
So in one sense, the environmental movement is actually a spiritual movement. It's not like spirituality over here. It's actually at its deepest core, it's a revisioning of the planet. And this is where I believe the scientists, my colleagues, who tend to dominate the environmental work, not the poets, not the theologians, but it's the scientists, because they got the measurements, they know.
Yeah.
But, they don't inspire. Most of them don't inspire. They have the facts, but they also then go back to and you've read plenty of professional papers, and I do a lot of work in the medical, with my medical colleagues, and I've submitted many papers, and there's a template that you close the journal submission with. It's a template statement. This is what our study shows, but we need a lot more study, and we're still not sure. Every one of them, every study, that's a scientific principle. It's called the Cautionary Principle, that you can't make a statement without a qualifying, we don't know. And that's what the right, I would call it the conservative, reactive, alt-right has jumped on in the climate studies. They use that loophole. Well, see, we're not sure. The evidence, it just says it points to it. There's no proof. There's no proof. And to me, that's where the science falls short. And I think when I hear Fauci talk about the pandemic that is now just, doing the reset on the planet and threatening to haunt and change us forever here in our culture, in our society, I find him limited by the science, because he keeps going back to say, we will go back to normal. Once we get the vaccine, we can start to open up again. You see where he falls short, in my opinion. He doesn't have a vision that, no, this is the game change. This is a potential game changer. We can start to live in a new way with each other. This morning in the New York Times, I read, the stock market is rising. Today is August 15th. So the stock market yesterday, highest rise in 100 days since the Great Depression. So the writer says, and this is on the business page, well, is this really, what's really happening here? What's happening here is the large businesses are swallowing the small businesses. They're buying them up. So their stocks are rising. It's not the small businesses that are rising. They're dying. And then the writer ends with this. Is this really the world that we want? A rising stock market because all the box stores have bought out all the small grocery stores in our communities? And there are no middle-level restaurants anymore. There's just essentially for the elite, and then the rest of us are eating fast food. Is that really? And then we can all boast that the stock market is rising so high. So that's where my point here is. That's where I believe that the science, quote, approach, without spiritual or without the faith community's input, without visionary, without the poetic input, without, Terry Tempest Williams, without Barry Lopez, without visionaries, falls short. And we asked in the faith community, at our best, we like to ask the deeper question, which is, what is a good life? What is a good life? And how much is enough? In a consumer society like we have, how much is enough? Well, so, those are questions that are coming out of the faith-based kind of internal dialogue that I carry. Go.
Sure. Well, what I hear you saying is that while there's a place for science and the information, the hard data that comes from it, there's also a role for the spiritual religious perspective and trying
That's correct.
deeper questions. So that makes me think of when you were on the Lake Superior Binational Forum.
Yes.
You were the religious community representative.
Yes.
So to me, that was sort of it sounds like at least, that was a forum, a place where we saw those two roles coming together. So what was,
Absolutely.
What was that like, serving as the religious community representative? on the binational.
Yeah, well, I found it a tremendous honor and an absolutely educational experience. We moved around. We had community forums, and oftentimes around very controversial issues like proposed mines and proposed mine in Wawa, Canada, issues around fisheries in Duluth, timber practices. And so at the end of our meetings, which would run a couple days, we'd have an open forum, usually around a controversial issue, and then there'd be a presenter and people could speak. So there was a lot of, back and forth, and it was a tremendous, how might you say it, kind of educational experience for me, learning finding the complexity of many of these issues. Now, the frustration that I had, and this goes back to my mental health training, okay, is the other thing that religion addresses is the human condition. What is the human condition? Now, Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a theologian, ethicist, taught at Union Theological Seminary, Barack Obama said he was the most influential influence on his own sense of governing. And so did Henry Kissinger. They're two different cats, but Niebuhr grew up in Detroit, or served his parish in Detroit in the late 30s when the unions began to rise. And he wrote a book called Moral Man and Immoral Society. It was his classic piece based on experience working with the unions. And it was all about the human condition. And here's what he said. There are two dangers, because how we see the human condition is how we're going to navigate our way through life. There are two dangers. And by the way, religion addresses them. But here's the polarities. One is the world's a jungle. Winner takes all. And you could see that in Roger Stone's interview. Go get Roger Stone. It was a documentary that was made about 3 or 4 years ago. And he ends it, Roger Stone ends the interview with this statement. To the interviewer, says, what about the lies that you've perpetuated? He said, he laughed and he said, hey, it's about winning. That's all this is about. He was a counselor, he was an advisor to Reagan, Goldwater, and of course, Trump's, inner circle he is. And he's just been, pardoned, right, for his misconduct. So, but he ends up, winner takes all. That's his position. Winner takes all. That's one position. So that's translated into profits, doesn't it? Profits. Winner takes all. Who wins? The people that get the profits win. So that's the game. So the earth is part of the chips on the table that you use to win the game, resources. On the other side, Niebuhr said, was an idealist. And they want the perfect society. They're the radical leftists. They want it to be good, equal, housing for everybody. Everybody's going to be nice to each. We don't need police. That's that. We don't need police. That's the other side. Niebuhr said, here, this is so fascinating. Both these lead to disaster. And he said, but one leads to disaster in a more dangerous way than the other. Which one do you think it was? The idealist or the jungle? I don't want to do a rhetorical trick on you, but yeah, you tend to think it'd be the jungle, like Stone's comment, winner takes all. Niebuhr said, no, the idealist. because the idealist doesn't see boundaries. The pragmatist, or the person who sees the world as a jungle, at least knows there are forces going to push back on them. The idealist will throw people under the bus. And so his position is this, that you must find the balance, and it's negotiable all the time. This balance between the two. And that's what religion does. That's why we have a confession of sins in our liturgy, in those of us from liturgical traditions. We ask for God's forgiveness at the beginning of the service. And people say, why are you asking that? Why are we doing a confession of sins? It's to humble ourselves. And this is a beautiful thing from the Native community. All their rituals that I participated in, and I participated in hundreds of them across, here in the Upper Peninsula, but also in the Pacific Northwest for years. They always begin with, grandfather, have pity on us, have pity, have mercy on us. The same opening line as the Christian liturgy, which is, Lord, have mercy on us. It's to acknowledge our humbleness, our short-sightedness, our need for help. Now in the forum, you could see these things happening. You could see these idealists and these pragmatic folks. You could see the scientists, cautious scientists who thought everything could be saved by science, but not knowing how to motivate people because there was no dream. So you saw these forces working with each other, against each other. So it was a great lab experience, and for me. And I would probably end by saying, if to your question, it was a deepening of my understanding of the complexity of environmental issues and the need to have, and this goes back to the spiritual piece, to be clear about your own perspective on the human condition, which is essentially, Dan, a religious issue. Who are we as people? What is, this thing called sin? What is it? What does that mean? And how does that affect how we relate with one another? And to quote Pope Francis, just last year in his documentary, when he put that out all together, he said, the poorest of the poor is Mother Earth, and we have destroyed her. So he was able to see that our imbalance, our quote sin, if we want to use a Hebrew Christian term, or if you want to go Buddhist, you could say our illusion, our illusion about the earth. We have come out of balance. We have come out of balance. So let's go back to Fauci. Fauci's saying, we're going to go back to normal. We just got to get the vaccine. No, it's not going to work. Normal to what? See? And we have an opportunity to reset. And the environmental voice is the activists. We have to be able to say, let's learn to live differently. Let's learn how to live differently with our earth. Let's lift up a vision of what it means to lead a good life, What is that going to look like versus what we thought in the 1950s and 60s?
So this idea of the pandemic being a moment where we can sort of rework what we
Yes.
think of as the life that we want, or the life that we have.
Yes.
I've noticed on your website for the Cedar Tree Institute, you have a series of writings titled "The Wood Chips."
Yes.
And you've been writing lately about the pandemic. And if I'm reading what you're saying correctly, a lot of this comes back to the idea of this of a new moment, of
Yes,
turning the page, of saying goodbye to the way we did things before and kind of going to something new.
right.
Well, what is what does that mean in terms of our relationship, our connection to, or our work on behalf of the Great Lakes? So what is that new moment that we see coming out
Yes.
of this
Oh,
time?
sure. I think a great example of that is an attempt, first of all, to get to know your neighborhood. Get to know the neighborhood you're in, your watersheds. Get to know how your water is tested. Get to know the invasive plants that are affecting, in other words, a commitment to the environment that you live in, your natural environment, and steep yourself in that. E.O. Wilson had a beautiful ending to one of his recent books. He was the Nobel Prize winner, etymologist. But he said, the generations, our grandchildren, he said, will look back at our generation and have his prediction, they're going to have two kind of feelings or thoughts, or they're going to be living in two different realities. First of all, they're going to know more about the environment than we ever could dream. Because for us to survive on the planet, we've got to know it's not working. You know, Bezos wants us to build colonies now on other planets. That's the dream of Silicon Valley, to go to other planets to establish human communities so that in case this planet goes down, there'll be somewhere else to live. I mean, that is the complete hubris. It's a complete delusion to me, an abandonment of all spirituality and a denial of the human condition, fueled by capitalist dollars. So, and by the way, those trips to Mars or whatever he's got planned, they're all filled up already. They cost 200 grand or whatever, 200,000. They're all bought up for years. So people are jumping. They're buying into his vision. So let's go back to the question you asked. Help me reframe it. I was just on a roll there. So
Yeah, that's okay. That's all right. So my question was, given that we are at this new moment, the
yes.
pandemic has forced
Yeah,
us
yeah,
to this.
yes.
I mean, the protests around George
Right.
Floyd have forced this. We're in a new moment. What
Right.
does that new moment look like in terms of our
Oh, yeah.
relationship with the
Okay. Here's what he said.
parent?
E.O. Wilson. People are going to know their environment. And faith communities, my bias, will be the place that will be known for this. I mean, people who join faith communities are really going to be, they're going to have whole workshops, and their whole educational community will be devoted to understanding their natural environment, not just what nice trees look like, but their drinking water, pollinators, understanding pollinators. They're going to have community gardens involved. They're going to have regular speakers and bringing in the native community, rituals, redesigning liturgies around the earth. So that's one. E.O. Wilson says our grandchildren will know about the earth more. And I'm hoping the churches will be part of that can help lead on that. The second thing is they will resent us. They will resent us, our generation, for, like Greta Thunberg, you know, I mean, she's angry. And she's a prophet, like right out of the Old Testament, my opinion. And she, holds no quarter for our generation. She said, look what you're handing down to us. And so he said, there's going to be this incredible resentment. What have you done? All that points toward an imbalance in how we live with the earth. So commitment to your neighborhood. And then I think, and this is tough, but an examination of our economic system and its value, and in terms of justice and compassion, not only for each other, but justice and compassion for the earth, for the natural resources we live with. And you see now this in the growing Eat for the Planet movement. You're starting to see this, plant-based diet. It used to be all about health. Now people are saying, don't just eat for your health, you eat for the planet. In other words, but in a plant-based diet, what you're going to be able to do is save, hundreds of thousands of acres that are used to feed beef cattle in Central America or in South America. There's going to be a shift that will help bring balance also back to the earth. So how we eat, our values, and nobody quite knows exactly. I like Lopez. Who will be our navigators, he writes. Who will be our navigators? We're looking for those voices. Maybe you can be one of those voices, see, that lift through your work. One of the voices that, and maybe that's the purpose of the website, your website, is to help us navigate with our spiritual resources, to navigate what's ahead, because we don't know how bad it's going to get before we either level out. I'm not just talking about the virus, I'm talking economically here and socially. Let's say the New York Times was right this morning that the stock market continues to rise because of the big companies, corporations, and the small businesses continue to disintegrate. What is the world going to look like then? A tremendous gap between the rich and the poor then. Small, rich here, poor the rest of us. So your work, my gift to you from the Cedar Tree Institute is be one of our navigators. And maybe that's what you're doing right now, see? In your work.
Well, it's been a privilege to get to talk to folks like you in order to sort of get this out, so to speak. Well, so we're closing up on our time here, but
Yeah.
the last thing I want to ask you is, in terms of the work that you do for Lake Superior and the Great Lakes, what gives you hope?
My faith. I live in a dream. There was a theologian who once said that religion is a disciplined dream. Where you let's love one another. Okay, well, how in the hell are you going to do it? Let's do it then. Let's share. There are no tickets when you go to a church. You can come into a faith community. Nobody checks you at the door how much money you make. So there's a dream that there was let's put it this way, there's a promise of a dream in the symbols of my faith community. That's one thing that gives me hope. So my faith community carries me. The second thing is, and I'll say, again, going back to the resources in the faith community, I'll use two. This is from the 13th century. Julian of Norwich, who was a anchorite nun, or a hermit. She wrote a beautiful prayer. I heard it first in a sermon in Boulder, Colorado, and it stayed with me ever since. And then it's recently been made into a hymn that I've heard. So it's simply this: all shall be well. in all things, all shall be well. It doesn't say all is well, right? It doesn't say all is well. It doesn't say all was well. All shall be well. In all things, all shall be well. That's a faith position. That's not an evidence-based statement, but that comes from my faith community. Scripture, the Revelations, one day tears will be wiped away. Every tear shall be wiped away. And we will be dressed in white. You know, that's an image, a metaphor. There's even the one that I love, again, that gives me hope, is justice shall roll down one day from the mountains, and the lowly shall be lifted up, and the mighty will be brought down, and the lion will lie down with the lamb. And, you know, those are from my faith community. And of course, the young generation, my children, if you have children or grandchildren, you look, there's a hope, an innocence, a hope that is burns in them, that you see in their eyes. And I've been all over the world living in war-torn situations, and you see those kids, and you know, it's not the adults, the children, the innocence, the hope they have in refugee camps, in the poorest of the poor slums. There's this light. And boy, if we can harness it, if the faith communities can harness, that would be a great thing, and keep doing the work that we're doing. That's what gives me hope, my friend.
Well, that's great. Well, that's a good place to wrap the conversation on, a moment of
Sure.
hope. Well, thank you, Reverend Magnuson, for your time and visiting today and talking. I really appreciate it.
Sure. And bless your work, my friend. Bless your work.
Thank
All
you.
shall be well. Remember
All
that
shall
one.
be well. Yes.
All shall, in all things, all shall be well. All right. Thank you.